The station platform was a desolate expanse of shadowed concrete, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a few flickering gas lamps. A biting wind, carrying the metallic tang of distant industry and the damp scent of a forgotten rain, whipped around Arthur's trench coat, making him pull it tighter. Midnight had just chimed from an unseen clock tower, its mournful tolls echoing into the vast emptiness. He was alone, or so he thought, until the hulking silhouette of the last train groaned into view, a monstrous iron beast exhaling clouds of steam that momentarily swallowed the platform whole. Its arrival was less a grand entrance and more a spectral manifestation, silent save for the hiss of its brakes and the low thrum of some unseen engine. Arthur checked his worn ticket for the 10th time. Its details faded, almost illegible, but the destination, nowhere, remained starkly clear. He scoffed. A dry, humorless sound. A joke, surely. Placeholder. He hadn't questioned it when he'd purchased it, driven by an inexplicable urgency to just get on this train, to escape something. The memory of what he was escaping was as elusive as the warmth in the night air. He just knew he had to leave. The carriage door hissed open, revealing an interior bathed in a dim, sepia light that seemed to leach all vibrant color from the world. He stepped inside, the sudden silence striking him more profoundly than any noise could have. The carriage was indeed full, as his ticket had promised, yet not a single soul stirred. His gaze swept across the occupants, a wave of profound unease washing over him. They were an eclectic collection, yet eerily uniform in their stillness. A woman in a faded flapper dress, her eyes wide and unblinking, stared out the window at a landscape that was nothing but an inky void. Across from her, a man in a Civil War uniform sat rigidly, a pristine, unlit pipe clutched in his skeletal fingers. Further down, a young boy in what looked like a Victorian sailor suit hugged a tattered teddy bear, his face pale and unnervingly placid. There were others, a stern-faced matron in a tweed suit, a shadowy figure hunched in the corner, almost part of the upholstery, and a figure cloaked entirely in black, whose face was obscured by the deep shadow of their hood. None of them acknowledged his presence. No rustle of newspaper, no murmurs of conversation, no shifting in their seats. They were like museum exhibits, perfectly preserved, yet disturbingly inert. Arthur felt a prickle of cold sweat on his brow. His breath, visible in the chilled air of the carriage, seemed out of place, a sign of unwelcome life in a tomb. He moved slowly down the aisle, his footsteps unnaturally loud on the plush, moth-eaten carpet. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the scent of old dust, ozone, and something else, something cloying and faintly metallic, like forgotten blood. He found an empty seat near the rear, facing forward, and sank into its surprisingly cold cushions. From this vantage point he could observe them all. Their stillness was the most unnerving aspect, not the stillness of sleep, but of profound, eternal repose. Their eyes, though some were open, held no light, no flicker of thought or emotion. They were vacant, fixed on nothing, or perhaps on something only they could perceive beyond the train's frosted windows. He tried to catch someone's eye, anyone's, but their gazes remained locked, indifferent. He cleared his throat, a small, tentative sound in the overwhelming silence. No reaction. A shiver traced its way down his spine, not from the cold, but from a chilling realization. He was the only one moving, the only one breathing. He was the only one alive in this carriage. The thought sent a jolt of icy fear through him, tightening his chest. This wasn't just a quiet train. It was a silent, macabre tableau. The train lurched forward with a soft, almost imperceptible tremor, gathering speed without the familiar clatter of wheels on tracks. There was no rhythmic sway, no reassuring rumble. It was as if the entire carriage, with its silent occupants, had merely detached from reality and begun to drift. The faint light from the platform vanished, swallowed by a darkness so absolute it felt ancient, primordial. Arthur pressed his face against the window, but saw only his own reflection superimposed over the spectral figures of the passengers, their faces distorted by the glass, merging with his own horrified visage. He pulled back sharply, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was wrong. All wrong. He fumbled for his phone, desperate for a connection. A sign that the outside world still existed. No signal. Just a blank screen reflecting his pale face. He tried to think, to rationalize. Perhaps it was a themed journey, a historical reenactment, but the vacant eyes, the oppressive silence, the pervasive chill, none of it felt like a performance. Felt real. Or rather, hyper-real, a reality twisted into something grotesque. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the silence. The soft creak of the woman in the flapper dress shifting in her seat. Arthur's head snapped towards her. Her head slowly, agonizingly, turned towards him. Her eyes, still wide and unblinking, now seemed to pierce him, not with malice, but with an ancient, unbearable sorrow. A faint, almost inaudible sigh escaped her lips, a sound like dry leaves skittering across barren ground. It was the first sound any of them had made, and it was infinitely more terrifying than a scream. He watched her, transfixed, his muscles rigid with dread. She lifted a skeletal hand, adorned with rings that looked centuries old, and slowly, deliberately, pointed a long, bony finger directly at him. Her lips, cracked and dry, parted slightly, but no words came, only that same mournful sigh, a whisper of a forgotten wind. The man in the Civil War uniform, who had been so still, now also began to turn his head, his movements stiff and jerky, like a rusted automaton. His eyes, though lacking pupils, seemed to fix on Arthur with a terrible, silent intensity. Then the boy in the sailor suit, then the matron, then the shadowy figure in the corner. One by one, like a terrible, slow-motion domino effect, every single passenger in the carriage began to turn their heads, their empty gazes converging on Arthur. The air grew impossibly colder, thick with a palpable dread. He could feel their gazes like physical pressure, pressing in on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. It was an unspoken accusation, a silent, damning judgment. He was the anomaly, the living intrusion, and in their collective, silent stare, he began to understand a terrifying truth. They weren't just strangers. They were bound by something dark and ancient, and he, Arthur, was now inextricably linked to it. The train was moving faster now, the darkness outside the windows an impenetrable void, and the only light was the sepia glow within, illuminating the silent, judging faces of his fellow passengers. He was trapped. But why was he trapped? And what exactly were these passengers? The collective stare was a physical force, pressing in on Arthur, squeezing the air from his lungs. Their vacant eyes, once merely unsettling, now burned with an ancient, silent fury. He stumbled back against the cold cushions of his seat, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The air, already thick with the scent of dust and ozone, now carried a faint, coppery tang, like an old wound. He wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but his throat was constricted, a knot of pure terror. The silence amplified his own ragged breathing, making him feel shamefully, terribly alive amidst this tableau of the dead. He tried to speak, a desperate, hoarse whisper escaping his lips. What is this? His voice was swallowed instantly, absorbed by the oppressive stillness as if it had never been uttered. The woman in the flapper dress, her skeletal hand still pointed, let out another of those dry, rustling sighs, a sound that seemed to scrape against the inside of his skull. The man in the Civil War uniform, his eyes like hollowed-out charcoal, seemed to lean forward infinitesimally, a subtle shift that conveyed an immense, predatory intent. The boy in the sailor suit, whose face had been placid, now wore an expression of profound, chilling sorrow, as if weeping silent tears of despair. The hostility emanating from them was no longer passive. It was a tangible pressure, a cold, invisible hand gripping his spirit. Their gazes, once merely fixed, now seemed to bore into him, dissecting him, stripping away his composure. He felt a desperate urge to flee, to find another carriage, to hurl himself from the train, anything to escape this suffocating judgment. But the train felt like a sealed coffin, and the darkness outside the windows was absolute, impenetrable, offering no solace or escape. He was trapped utterly and completely in this spectral carriage. Desperate for an anchor, for some shred of understanding, Arthur forced himself to look closer at the passengers, to seek an answer in their macabre stillness. He focused on the Civil War soldier. As he stared, a shimmering, almost imperceptible haze seemed to form around the man, a faint distortion in the sepia light. For a fleeting instant, Arthur felt a phantom chill, not just from the carriage's cold, but a biting wind carrying the phantom scent of gunpowder and damp earth. He saw, or rather felt, a flash of crimson, then the crushing weight of impact, the desperate gasp for air, and a final agonizing silence. It was a fragment, a whisper of a memory, too quick to grasp fully, yet undeniably linked to the soldier. A violent end. His gaze flickered to the woman in the flapper dress. Around her, the air seemed to ripple, and a faint, almost inaudible wail seemed to echo from an unseen distance. He smelled a phantom scent of stale perfume and cheap gin, mixed with something sharp and metallic, like a broken mirror. He sensed a desperate, frantic struggle, a betrayal, a fall from grace, and a final, suffocating despair. Her wide, unblinking eyes seemed to hold the echoes of 1,000 shattered dreams, and a cold, empty void where hope once resided. Another tragic, desperate end. A horrifying pattern began to coalesce in Arthur's mind. These weren't just ghosts. They were echoes, imprints of a final, violent moment. Each passenger, a silent testament to a life abruptly, tragically, or brutally severed. The matron's stern face seemed to ripple with a fleeting image of a suffocating fog, a sense of being lost and abandoned. The shadowed figure in the corner pulsed with an aura of immense, crushing guilt, a silent scream of regret. And the figure cloaked in black, they were a void, an absence, a cold dread that spoke of absolute, final oblivion. The train, meanwhile, had picked up an impossible speed. There was no clatter, no rumble, only a silent, seamless glide through the featureless dark. It felt less like a physical journey and more like a descent into an abyss. The sepia light within the carriage flickered, casting elongated, dancing shadows that made the spectral passengers seem to writhe and contort, their silent menace growing with each passing second. Their collective stare intensified, and Arthur could feel a distinct pressure building inside his own head, a throbbing behind his eyes, as if his sanity were being slowly, inexorably crushed. He pressed himself back further into the cold seat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He understood now, or at least began to. These were not just passengers. They were damned souls, forever bound to this train, each an embodiment of their own tragic or violent demise. And he, the living man, was the anomaly, the intruder. But why was he here? Why had he been drawn to this macabre locomotive? A chilling thought began to form, a tendril of dread that snaked through his veins. If they were all here because of how they died, then what did his presence on this train mean for him? The silent, accusing gazes of the spectral passengers seemed to offer a single, terrifying answer. He felt a profound, bone-deep certainty that his own purpose here was tied to their dreadful fates, and that the train had not simply picked him up by chance. He was not just a passenger. He was a potential victim, and the sinister mission of this train was slowly revealing itself. Arthur's mind raced, a desperate hamster on a wheel. He pressed himself further into the cold, plush seat, the rough fabric scratching against his cheek, a meager anchor in the swirling chaos of his fear. The air in the carriage, already thick with the scent of old dust and ozone, now seemed to press down on him, a physical weight that made his lungs ache for untainted oxygen. Each ragged breath he took felt like a sacrilege, a defiant gasp of life in a realm of the eternally still. He was, unmistakably, the anomaly, the glaring aberration in this macabre procession, and the collective stare of the spectral passengers was a brand, burning into his very soul. Why me? He wanted to scream, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the sheer, unyielding silence of the carriage. It wasn't just quiet. It was an active absence of sound, a vacuum that swallowed even the faint thrum of the train itself. He tried to rationalize, to find a logical explanation for the nightmare unfolding around him. A dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but the chilling cold, the pervasive smell of decay, the unsettling clarity of their vacant eyes. It was all too real, too visceral to be a figment of his imagination. He fumbled again for his phone, a pathetic gesture, knowing it was useless. Its blank screen, a dark mirror reflecting his own terrified face, only amplified his isolation. He was utterly cut off, adrift in a sea of spectral beings, on a train that defied the laws of physics and reality. The hostility emanating from them was no longer just a feeling. It was a palpable force, a cold current that seemed to flow directly from their unblinking eyes into his core. The woman in the flapper dress, her finger still rigidly pointed, seemed to lean imperceptibly forward, a faint, almost inaudible hum vibrating from her, a sound like dried bones rattling softly in a forgotten grave. It was a sound of ancient, boundless sorrow, but also of a chilling, possessive hunger. The man in the Civil War uniform, his face a mask of gaunt determination, slowly, agonizingly, raised his other arm, a spectral revolver now clutched in his hand, its barrel aimed not at Arthur, but at the floor beside him, a silent, damning symbol of his own violent end, and perhaps a premonition for Arthur's. Arthur flinched, pulling his legs up, his hands pressing against his ears, as if to block out the unspoken accusations, the phantom sounds of their final moments that seemed to echo around him. He squeezed his eyes shut, desperate to dispel the horrifying tableau, but the images were burned behind his eyelids. The flapper's accusing finger, the soldier's spectral gun, the boy in the sailor suit silent, weeping despair, a despair that seemed to mirror his own. When he opened his eyes again, the scene was unchanged. Only now the sepia light within the carriage seemed to pulsate, growing dimmer, then brighter, in an unsettling rhythm that matched the frantic beat of his heart. The shadows cast by the passengers stretched and contracted, making them appear to writhe and contort, their forms momentarily blurring, coalescing into grotesque caricatures of human suffering. He felt a throbbing behind his eyes, a pressure building in his skull, as if his mind itself was being squeezed, pressed into submission by their collective, silent will. He had to move, to do something, anything to break this terrifying spell. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest, and stumbled down the aisle, away from the intense focus of their gazes. He needed to find the conductor a break, an exit, anything that connected to the world he knew. But the further he went, the more uniform the carriages became, each one an exact replica of the last, filled with the same silent, spectral occupants, each trapped in their own personal hell, their faces mirroring the same vacant, accusing stare. It was an endless loop, a horrific infinity. He pressed his face against a window in the next carriage, trying to discern something, anything, outside. The impenetrable darkness remained, but then, a fleeting glimpse, a flicker at the very edge of his peripheral vision. A towering skeletal tree, its bare branches clawing at the void. He blinked, pulled back, then looked again. Nothing, just the endless dark. He moved to the next window, then the next, a frantic, desperate search. And then he saw it again, the same skeletal tree, and again, and again. A cold, sickening realization washed over him, colder than the carriage's pervasive chill. The train was not moving forward, not truly. It was moving in a circle, or perhaps not moving at all, but rather existing in a timeless, spaceless void. There was no destination, no end to this journey. They were simply here, forever, no final destination. A whisper seemed to echo in his mind, not his own voice, but a collective, mournful sigh that permeated the very fabric of the train. It was the voice of the dead, the understanding of the damned. This was not a journey. It was an existence, an eternal confinement. As this terrifying truth settled upon him, the spectral passengers in the carriage around him seemed to stir, not with sudden movement, but with a subtle internal shift. The woman in the flapper dress, Her eyes, still fixed, now seemed to shimmer, and a faint, almost forgotten melody, a tinny jazz tune, seemed to emanate from her, a ghostly echo of a forgotten dance hall. The scent of cheap gin and rose perfume became stronger, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. She had died in the roaring 20s, a victim of excess and betrayal. Her life a glittering, fragile bubble popped by a cruel hand. The Civil War soldier, his phantom gun still aimed at the floor, now seemed to be surrounded by the faint scent of damp earth and black powder, a faint, distant roar of cannons, the desperate shouts of men, and the chilling clang of bayonets seemed to fill the air around him. He was a soldier, fallen on a muddy battlefield, his breath leaving him with a final, desperate prayer for a world he would never see again. His death was in the mid-19th century, a brutal end to a brutal war. The boy in the sailor's suit, whose silent tears had so unnerved Arthur, now seemed to radiate an overwhelming sense of cold, dark water. Arthur felt a phantom chill, the sensation of being dragged down into an icy abyss, the crushing pressure of the deep. He heard faint, distant screams, the splintering of wood, and the gurgling sound of lungs filling with water. A shipwreck, a lost child, drowned in the vast, indifferent ocean, sometime in the late 1800s. The stern-faced matron in tweed now carried the faint, sickening smell of stale medicine and the oppressive silence of a lonely, sterile room. Arthur saw a vision of a hospital bed, a slow, drawn-out decline, a life fading without a touch, a final breath exhaled into an empty room. Her death, perhaps in the mid-20th century, was one of quiet solitude and neglect, each passenger a living, or rather unliving, testament to a different era, a different manner of crossing the threshold. They were a macabre tapestry woven from the threads of history, each thread abruptly, brutally, or tragically cut short. The train was not just a vehicle for the dead. It was a museum of their final moments, an eternal echo chamber of their last breaths. And Arthur, the only living soul, was now walking among them, breathing their stagnant air, witnessing their eternal torment. A new, more horrifying truth began to dawn on him, a truth whispered by the collective, ancient sorrow of the spectral passengers. If this train had no destination, if it merely carried the dead, the echoes of those whose lives had been violently or tragically severed, and if he was the only living one, then his presence here was not a coincidence. It was a summons, preparation. He was not just a passenger, he was an invitation. The train was not taking him to a destination. It was taking him to them. He was not merely trapped. He was being recruited. He was the anomaly, the intruder, but also, terrifyingly, the next candidate, the next addition to their silent, eternal procession. And with that thought, a new, profound dread settled into his bones, colder and more absolute than anything he had felt before. He was not just observing their fate. He was meant to join it. The weight of this realization was crushing, suffocating. He had to escape, had to fight, but against what? A train that defied reality? A legion of the eternally damned? His gaze swept across the silent, watching faces, their empty eyes now seeming to gleam with a new, terrible anticipation. He had to find a way out before he became one of them, before his own final moment became another exhibit on this endless, horrifying ride. Arthur's blood ran colder than the carriage's pervasive chill, congealing in his veins with the horrifying truth. No final destination, an eternal loop, a museum of the dead, and he, the sole living exhibit. A profound, crushing dread settled into his bones, heavier than any physical burden. His breath hitched, a desperate, ragged sound in the suffocating silence. He was not merely trapped. He was being assessed, measured, prepared. The next candidate. No, he choked, the word a mere whisper swallowed by the train's unyielding stillness. He lunged from his seat, a frantic, desperate surge of adrenaline coursing through his limbs. He had to escape. He had to fight. His gaze darted around the carriage, searching for anything, any semblance of an exit, a lever, an emergency brake, a window that might shatter. He stumbled towards the nearest door, his hands clawing at the ornate handle, twisting, pulling, pushing with all his might. It was solid, unyielding, as if welded shut. He slammed his shoulder against it, again and again, the dull thud echoing unnaturally in the plush silence, a pathetic testament to his futile struggle. He could feel the eyes of the spectral passengers on him, 1,000 invisible needles pricking his skin, their collective gaze a silent, damning judgment. He risked a glance back. The flapper woman had shifted infinitesimally, her skeletal hand now hovering, not pointing, but beckoning, a chilling invitation. The soldier's phantom gun seemed to shimmer, the faint scent of gunpowder growing stronger, mingling with the earthy smell of a fresh grave. The boy in the sailor suit merely watched, his eyes wide and brimming with an ancient, sorrowful understanding that seemed to say, "Asterisk, you can't escape. We tried." Asterisk. Ignoring them, Arthur spun, pressing his face against the window, his breath fogging the cold glass. He scraped at the frost, desperate to see beyond the impenetrable darkness. His reflection stared back, distorted by the glass, his face pale and contorted with fear, superimposed over the spectral figures of the passengers. He clawed at the glass, then pounded on it, his knuckles aching with the impact. It was thick, unyielding, a solid, unbreaking barrier. He could hear no sound from outside, no wind, no distant city hum, just the silent, seamless glide of the train, deeper into the void. He moved frantically through the carriage, a caged animal, pulling at every handle, pushing every window, each futile attempt draining him further, leaving him breathless and trembling. He passed the matron, whose stern face now seemed to soften with a chilling, knowing pity. He passed the shadowy figure, whose aura of guilt now seemed to emanate not just regret, but a profound, weary resignation. And the cloaked figure, a void of absolute dread, seemed to lean back, as if observing a play reaching its inevitable climax. The sepia light in the carriage pulsed erratically, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced and writhed, making the silent passengers appear to shift, their forms momentarily blurring, as if caught between states of being. The air grew impossibly heavy, thick with the cloying scent of forgotten blood and the metallic tang of ozone, now laced with a faint, sweet, sickening odor, like lilies on a coffin. A throbbing headache began to pound behind Arthur's eyes, a rhythmic pressure that mirrored the frantic beating of his heart. He felt his sanity fraying at the edges, stretched taut by the unbearable tension. He found himself back in his original seat, collapsing onto the cold cushions, utterly exhausted, defeated. He stared blankly at the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This was it then. He was truly trapped. His eyes, devoid of hope, scanned the worn, patterned carpet. And then he saw it. Nestled between the plush seat cushion and the armrest, almost hidden by the shadows, was a small, folded piece of paper. It looked out of place, pristine against the aged, moth-eaten fabric. A tendril of icy dread snaked through his veins, colder than anything he had felt before. He hesitated, his hand trembling, before reaching out and picking it up. The paper was stiff, unnaturally cold to the touch, like parchment left in a crypt. He unfolded it slowly, his fingers stiff, his eyes wide and unblinking. The paper was blank save for a single line of elegant, old-fashioned script, written in what looked like dried blood. The words seemed to leap off the page, burning themselves into his mind with a searing, undeniable clarity. Asterisk. You are the next victim. Asterisk. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The words echoed in his skull, not as a whisper, but as a booming, resonant truth. The air was sucked from his lungs, leaving him gasping. He stared at the note, then at his trembling hands, then at the silent, watching faces of the spectral passengers. Their gazes, which had been hostile, now seemed to shift, softening into a chilling, knowing acceptance, profound, ancient sorrow, and a terrible, silent welcome. He felt a sudden, inexplicable chill that was not from the carriage, but from within him, a deep, pervasive cold that started in his chest and spread rapidly through his limbs. His breath, which had been coming in ragged gasps, suddenly hitched, caught in his throat, then simply ceased. He tried to take another breath, but his lungs refused to obey, as if they had forgotten how. Panic, cold and absolute, flared through him, but it was a fleeting sensation, quickly replaced by a profound, eerie calm. He felt a strange lightness, a detachment from his own body. He tried to move, to stand, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. He looked down at his hands, expecting to see them gripping the note, but they were translucent, faintly shimmering, like heat haze over a summer road. He could see the pattern of the carpet through his fingers. A wave of fragmented memories, sharp and brutal, crashed over him, unbidden, overwhelming. Not the fragmented echoes of the other passengers, but his own. He saw himself walking alone on a rain-slicked street, late at night. The blinding glare of headlights, the screech of tires, the sickening thud, the searing pain, brief but all-consuming, the taste of blood and asphalt, the chilling cold seeping into his bones as the rain turned to ice, the fading light, then the absolute profound darkness, and then the faint thrum of a train, pulling into a desolate station, its sepia light beckoning. He remembered the inexplicable urgency to board, the feeling that he had to get on this train, to escape. Escape what? Escape the cold, escape the pain, escape the finality. He looked around the carriage, his gaze sweeping over the silent, spectral figures. The woman in the flapper dress, the soldier, the boy in the sailor suit, the matron, the shadowy figure, the cloaked void. Their eyes, once vacant, now seemed to hold a shared understanding, a quiet, knowing empathy. They were no longer hostile. They were fellow travelers, and he, Arthur, was one of them. He raised his translucent hand, slowly, to his face. There was no warmth, no breath. He looked down at his body, the trench coat, the worn ticket still clutched in his now spectral fingers. He was sitting in the same seat, but it no longer felt cold. He no longer felt anything. He was silent, still, vacant. His gaze drifted to the window. His reflection was still there, but it was no longer distorted by fear. It was calm, empty. He saw himself, superimposed over the endless darkness outside, shimmering faintly, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on nothing, or perhaps on something only he could perceive beyond the frosted glass. He was one of them. He had never left the train. He had never left the street. He had never left the moment of his death. He had just boarded the last train. His journey had just begun, and it would never end.